Hey friends, you probably have heard us talking about monitoring as code here at Checkly. With monitoring as code, you can code, test, and deploy your entire monitoring setup, and you can update your monitoring when you push your source code and your application code to production. And we just released two new features, so the code exporter and the activity log, that will enable you to adopt monitoring as code in your software development lifecycle, but also will help you to get started with monitoring as code. Does that sound good? Let's get to it. But before I show you the new Checkly features, let's briefly talk about the software development lifecycle. So shipping software to production usually includes analysis, design, development, testing, deployment, and then later on maintenance. And when we consider development, testing, and deployment, these usually happen in different environments. So development happens on your dev machine, right? You're building things and developing things on your local machine. Once you're happy with the result, you push these changes using Git to your staging or preview environment to double check if things work properly. And once you're happy with the result, you push these new changes to production. And especially when you consider monitoring, you probably have the experience that the further you get to the right, the more manual work you have to do. We're thinking here about ClickOps, right? You are setting up your monitoring manually. But with monitoring as code, you can consider your monitoring right from the start. So in the development phase, you can define your checks, your monitoring resources right in your repository. And if you have to, you can debug your future monitoring right on your local machine. Once you push to your staging or preview environments, you can run your end-to-end tests and your monitoring against this preview deployment and ensure that everything is working properly to then ship to production. And once you hit the deploy button, it's literally just the snap of a finger to reuse these monitoring resources and turn on production monitoring to get alerted when things go down or when you experience outages. And this is monitoring in a nutshell. So let me show you how this works in the Checkly world. Here we have the Checkly web app, and you see that I have two checks running on a schedule. I have a fetch book list API check that monitors an API endpoint every 2 minutes. And next to it, I have a check called homepage spec TS that uses Headless Chrome and Playwright to monitor a website every 5 minutes. So how could you create a new check and start monitoring in Checkly? What you always can do in the UI is you can hit this lovely plus button over here, and you can choose between API check, browser check, and we have some news. There's now a new check type that is called heartbeat checks. So if you want to learn more, I will drop a link into the description below. But let's create a new browser check here in the UI. First of all, you can choose from our predefined templates. So let's pick a random one. You can give it a name. So let's call this example. You can give it a tag if you want to, and then you can already save it. And now you started monitoring a website with Playwright. I won't go into the details here, but what you can do in the UI is you can run this browser check, and this now kicks off a new browser check run, and we will be able to access videos, traces, and all the good Playwright stuff here right in the UI. If you want to tweak the settings of this check, you can define different frequencies. You can choose different locations, like let's run this from California and Hong Kong. And now we can apply this and we can hit save. So here we have the results already. We just controlled Headless Chrome by just clicking a few buttons. But you might now say, but hold on, this is exactly what we always did in the world of ClickOps, right? And you're right. But if you want to get started using Checkly, or you already have a lot of browser checks and API checks that are not leveraging as code yet, let me show you something very cool. You can now go into your checks in the Checkly UI and you can hit the export to code button. And here we have the instructions on how to start using this already defined and already running check in the world of monitoring as code. It gives us instructions on how to use the Checkly CLI. I will show you that in just a moment. But the cool thing is that we have here now the code definitions to port this check over into my code base. When we open the file drawer, we will find a TypeScript definition for this browser check and also the Playwright code that we just had a look at. If you want to leverage Terraform and not the Checkly CLI, there are options for this one too. So let me head over to VS Code, and here we already have a monitoring as code project. It defines a Checkly config in the root, which holds all the basic or default configuration for your Checkly project. And we have an API check and a heartbeat check and a playwright-based homepage spec. So what we now can do is we could either download these two files over here, but let me just quickly copy this. So let's open the drawer. We have an example check.ts file. So let me copy this to the clipboard. Let's add a new check over here, which is called example check.ts. And let's paste this code over here. And what we need next to it is an example spec.ts. So let's create this one quickly too, example spec.ts. And now we can also copy this code over, and guess what? This is all it takes to now run this browser check from your command line or deploy it and update it via the Checkly CLI. So when I now go to the terminal and I run npx checkly test, you will see that we now have multiple checks running from my local environment running in the Checkly infrastructure. So here we have the example check file that we just copied over, and it's now visiting the site and taking screenshot, similar to what we just did in the UI. And this is exactly the flow that you would do in your CI/CD setup or in your development and testing phase. You would create your monitoring as code resources like this browser check while you're developing the features. And then you push it and add it to your code base, and you run the tests not against a local environment, but rather against your preview environment. So what we now can do is we can go in here, we can add the two files, and I can commit this. So let's call it add new check. The cool thing now is that when I push this code, so let me push this very quickly. What I can do is I can also run npx checkly test, and I can add a record flag. The record flag will make these test runs to an actual test session, and they are persisted over time. So when you're putting your monitoring resources into your CI/CD pipeline, you will get a handy URL giving you all the results so that you can, when you check your CI/CD provider and want to see why certain things failed, you can head over to this test session section. And here we have now add new check. This was the test run that we just had. And here we have this new example check. This is the flow for testing your new features, but it didn't start monitoring it. So what you have to do to monitor is you have to run npx checkly deploy. This will take all the resources that you defined in your monitoring as code repository and will push them and deploy them to the Checkly infrastructure. So when we now give this a refresh here, we have now here our example check. That is the new one. I can now remove this one coming from the UI. And we just codified our entire monitoring setup. When I now develop a new feature, let it be a UI feature or a new API endpoint, I can think of the monitoring resources while developing the new feature. Then I can test these out in my staging or testing environment. And once I deploy to production, I can just push these changes to Checkly, and then I can turn on the actual monitoring of these new resources that I just deployed. But let me show you the second feature that we just released. When we now have a look at this example check that we just exported from the UI, we now show you the activity log. So you see that this check was created via the Checkly CLI and is picking up the Git information of this particular commit. So when someone is updating the monitoring resources, people can go in and they can have a look at the repository. And we see here that this check was created with this particular commit, which is this one. So when you then deploy to production and you update your monitoring setup, you can have a look at the activity log in Checkly to find out what happened when. So let me show you another example, saying we're going in here and we change the frequency of this browser check. So what we can do is we change it to every 10 minutes. Let me add this again. Let me commit this, update check. And let me deploy that again to Checkly. So what happens now is that I'm updating this browser check construct, and we now have a refresh over here. We can keep track in Checkly and have a look what happened when, right? So when we have a look now here, we see that it was deployed less than a minute ago. And if I want to learn where this resource is coming from, again, I can go to GitHub or whatever repository URL you provide to find out what happened. And the cool thing about the activity log is that it's not limited to checks. So for example, let me show you the dashboards. And guess what? When I go in here and I have a look at the activity log, I can really follow the updates of my monitoring resources. And this is just a very, very handy addition. So in summary, if you have checks running in Checkly that are not based on monitoring as code yet, you can always go to the Checkly UI and you can export this code by clicking a few buttons and adding them to your monitoring as code project. And now for most of the resources and constructs in Checkly, let it be alert channels, let it be checks, let it be dashboards, we now provide the activity log that shows you when things were created, who updated them, and when. And we see this as an essential feature of the monitoring as code workflow that is integrating tightly into your software development lifecycle. And these are our 2 new features. I hope you enjoy them. If you have any feedback, drop them in the comments below or sign up for our Checkly community Slack. You will find the link in the description below. And I'm Stefan, and I will talk to you very, very soon again.